someone who has trouble remembering things? Are there things that you wish you knew to help support a loved one managing cognitive decline? Today, we aim to provide some resources to help you with this. Hello, and thank you for joining this session of Connecting Our Community. The goal of this series is to connect the special needs community with valuable resources, and these sessions are offered on the fourth Wednesday of each month at 11:45 a.m. My name is Christine Brookins. For those of you who are not familiar with me, you can know that I am both a family member and a professional dedicated to serving the disability community. Because of this, I founded Outspoken to give a voice to those who may not be heard. Each month, we speak with experts in fields relevant to this community, and I am always open to suggestions for topics that would be important to you. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Sara Murphy. Sara Murphy is a Vice President for Programs and Services for the Greater Pennsylvania chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. She has been with the association close to 13 years, serving in a couple of chapters. Prior to moving to Pennsylvania in 2016, Sara served as the program director for the Mississippi chapter. Here in Pennsylvania, she oversees the core service delivery of programs and services by way of community partners and volunteers. Sara has a background in nutrition, wellness, intergenerational programming, and gerontology. Sara has experience in caring for those individuals living with Alzheimer's and other dementia, as she has worked in the long-term care industry for 5 years with all levels of care, from independent living residents to memory care, prior to her work with the association. Sara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Christine, for having me.
I'm sure we're going to unpack a lot of things here, but during Mental Health Awareness Month and just ahead of Alzheimer's Awareness Month, we thought it would be appropriate to have a conversation around brain health. Mental health often has a negative connotation. However, if we reframe the narrative around brain health, we can break that stigma and gain a better understanding. So to get us started, can you tell us what is Alzheimer's and what is the difference from dementia?
Yes, that is a very common question that I get, and I want to say, first of all, thank you, Christine, for recognizing the need to talk about this, Alzheimer's disease and other dementia, and all that you do in the community. You're wonderful to get to know. But so when we talk about the term dementia, so dementia is that umbrella term, right? Similar to the term cancer, right? There's many different forms of cancer. Dementia is that overall umbrella term, general term used to describe the group of symptoms that cause some form of memory impairment that impacts the individual's ability to do their activities of daily living. So it also can impact their ability to think, plan, their executive functioning, and reasoning. And as we think about the term dementia, right, umbrella term, and then there's many different forms of dementia. There's over 100 different forms of dementia. And because of time's sake, we won't go over all the many different types of dementia, but Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. So right now, it probably makes up about 60 to 80% of the cases of dementia. And that type of dementia really impacts the ability of someone for their memory impairment, which then impacts their ability, again, to think, plan, reason, and also could be a result of changes in their personality and behavior. And so as we think about that, I will want to highlight there's other forms of dementia that recently we probably have heard more about in the news because of some famous individuals, unfortunately, that have received a diagnosis of other forms of dementia. Bruce Willis comes to mind, right? So we talk about other forms. Vascular dementia is, to get personal, my grandmother had vascular dementia, and that is the second most common type of dementia. So vascular dementia, what happens, it impacts the blood flow circulation to the brain. That usually is a result of a stroke or group of many strokes. And so we start to see impacts of that from the behavior. There's some hallucinations. There's a more stair-step decline than if someone with the Alzheimer's type. So then we also have frontal temporal dementia, FTD, which again impacts the frontal temporal lobe, which impacts typically personality and language. first. And so when we talk about famous people, Bruce Willis, unfortunately, he's come to the forefront of that. Lewy body dementia as well. That's more of an individual that has some Parkinsonians like dementia symptoms, some tremors, and an increase of hallucinations as well. And when I say hallucinations, I mean something that someone sees, perceives that's real to them, right? But not you and I. And I will say real to them, right? Because my grandmother, with her diagnosis of vascular dementia, so she had a stroke in her home, and we started within the next few weeks, she started seeing Fido, her dog, which was her dog that she had growing up as a child, and was communicating with Fido, talking, and so that was actually one of the warning signs for us that we weren't quite sure what was going on with her. And then we started seeing, right, some cognitive deficits, some memory lapses, not able to make her famous chocolate meringue pie, missing steps out of the recipe. So to sum that question up, Christine, there are many forms of dementia. And so when someone is diagnosed with dementia, right, it again is going back to that overall term, for the group of conditions. But Alzheimer's disease, we talk so much more about it because it is more commonly diagnosed, and it's just a commonly type of dementia.
Thank you, because that unpacked a lot right there. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive in how is Alzheimer's diagnosed?
So this question is one that I think is so important because we're at about 90% accuracy of diagnosing someone specifically for Alzheimer's disease. We've come a long way from the very beginning with Dr. Alzheimer's, hence why it's called that, is because the gentleman who discovered it in one of his patients noticed some of the symptoms, some of the changes, and noticed some changes within the brain that impacted his discovery of Alzheimer's disease. But typically, you don't just get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease by asking a couple of questions, right? And I say that because we've had people who come to us and say, well, I went to my physician and I said I've had some memory changes and now I'm receiving this medication for Aricept, right? And so that's not a dignified, proper diagnosis. There is no unfortunate one test that says, yes, you have Alzheimer's disease currently. There's a lot of fascinating things, research in the pipeline, but essentially there's a full battery of tests that essentially rules out other potential causes, which we'll get to in a little bit, of some of the warning signs of some of the changes that individual might be experiencing or they have seen with their loved one. And so, for example, they'll do a full physical examination, do blood work, assess nutrition deficiencies, potentially B12 levels, thyroid, metabolic disorders, dehydration. So some of those things could actually mimic signs of dementia, which will, like I said, we'll get into what are some of those signs and symptoms later. And then physicians also, if they feel your PCP feels that there is a need to go to seek advice of a specialist. So someone like a neurologist, a geriatrician, they can use very specific diagnostic tools to look at the brain. So when we think about brain imaging, you actually can go and look at MRI, CT, PET scans to see the impact potentially of what's known as amyloid and plaque. And so those are the two bad guys when talking about this disease. Similar to amyloid, similar to plaque buildup within our teeth is not good. So amyloid plaque buildup in between the brain cells, you can actually detect and see this within brain imaging. And so that really helps, in addition to the medical history, to some of the physical examinations that I talked about earlier, blood work, physical examination. All of this can help provide that comprehensive diagnosis. And so again, in the very near future, they're looking at potential blood tests, right, to be able to detect it and identify it. We are not there yet, right? But you can get advice and cognitive screenings early on with your primary care provider.
Okay.
If you are over the age of 65 and you are a Medicare beneficiary, you have the right to, within your physical checkup, right? So your annual wellness visit, which hopefully anyone who is over the age of 65 is doing.
Right.
It should be just as normal as you're checking your blood pressure, right? Is actually having a cognitive screening to test cognitive health. And so I'll pause for a second, Christine, because cognitive health is not something that we typically talk about. We talk a lot about heart health, but we don't talk a lot about cognitive health. And so that's something that should be assessed. So when we talk about potential early detection,
Right.
potential, that's really huge. But hopefully that's helpful to understand that it's not just one test, but it should be a battery of tests and could potential be not just your primary care provider, but they could refer you to a specialist to do some additional testing like brain imaging if they think it's warranted.
So looking at that, and I'm sure I'm glad to learn that Medicare will cover it for anyone, but why would someone get tested? What would be the things that would prompt someone to get tested for Alzheimer's?
So it's so important to, I think, understand the difference between what's normal age-related memory loss,
Sure.
which is, and I say this all the time, not to be negative, but we're all aging as we're sitting here listening to this conversation. We all are aging. And we have to understand too that it is normal to lose brain cells, right? Nerve cells as we age, but not to the severity and to the degree as if someone who has a type of dementia. And one thing that I usually say, and you might have heard this, Chrissy, when I do presentations or we do talks, I have people repeat after me that dementia is not a normal part of aging. So if you are, and I just pick on, if you're over the age of 65 and you're like, gosh, I tend to be forgetting things more, when I walk into the room and you forget maybe why you walked in there, or you are in a room and you're like, well, what's the name of that person again? And, so we tend to, as we age, unfortunately, tend to fear, oh my gosh, I hope I'm not getting, right, Alzheimer's or disease or some type of dementia. So when we talk about the importance of getting a diagnosis or understanding what the warning signs are,
Sure.
we can start there, because if you think about, unfortunately, the impact of this disease, there is a lot of planning. There's a lot of care planning. There's more treatments out there in the pipeline. It's really good to be able to understand what might be going on with some of these memory changes. And some of it could be peace of mind as well. And so when we think about, well, what is normal age-related memory loss? It actually goes into the Alzheimer's Association has launched in 2009. We launched a 10 warning signs campaign that really talked about know the 10 warning signs of Alzheimer's disease and understand what's the difference, right, between normal age-related memory loss versus something more serious like dementia. And so I will say that, I know towards the end of this, we'll talk about resources and where you can go to get some more information and support. And we do have the full list of what those 10 warning signs are. And for time's sake today, I'm going to highlight a few of them.
Please.
Because that are more common, if that's okay.
Yes.
So one of the most common warning signs of Alzheimer's disease is memory loss, right? So typically when we think about memory loss, it's that memory loss, though, because like I said, we're all guilty, right, Christine? If we misplace our phone or we walk into the room and we're like, well, who's the name of that person? It's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't think of it. Right, Christine? I mean, I think I have forgotten 2 things already this morning. I'm sure you have forgotten things yourself.
Absolutely.
Right. So when we think about that's normal, right? That's okay. And we do tend to lose the recall and retrieve information. That tends to slow down as we age, and that's okay. But what's not normal is if we start to have those memory changes or memory loss that starts to interfere with your abilities of activities of daily living. So things that we do every day that we take for granted, and it becomes consistent. And we start to need to rely on memory aids and other people to remember things, more consistency. And so it's starting to, on a consistent basis, starting to forget doctor's appointments. We all tend to maybe forget here and there, but it's really starting to forget those on a consistent basis. And then also we can see accusatory behavior. So it could be if someone is starting to misplace things or forget something and they don't have that ability to recall that information a little bit later, like some of us can, then they might start to blame someone closest to them. They're like, well, I didn't put that there. You obviously did, right? Because that ability to retrace your steps back and say, oh, okay, that was Joe Schmo, right, in that room. Or when I went into the kitchen, let's say you misplace your keys, which is common.
Right.
My uncle would, who had Alzheimer's disease, he would put his keys inside the freezer and wasn't able to retrace his steps back to realize, I went from the kitchen, then I went to the living room, and then I went to the bedroom, right? Oh, there are my keys, right? We have that ability to retrieve that information. My uncle would put his keys in the freezer, and then he would accuse his wife of, well, why did you do that? That's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous place to put them, right? So we start to see, the memory loss that's really starting to interfere. It's consistent basis. And then we can see that they start to potentially accuse someone else of doing that and starting to rely more on memory aids.
And I'm going to just ask, so it sounds like we can all misplace things from time to time, but the big difference there might be that I can't go back and recover. Like you said, recall and retrace, right?
Right.
So when you lose that ability, it may be an indicator.
Definitely an indicator.
Okay.
And it's starting to be that short term, that immediate recall, right? The ability to, to think about, you wake up and you think about the plan for the day, or you think about how many steps it might take to complete a task, any task. It could be, waking up and then I'm going to go and I'm going to brush my teeth and I'm going to walk into the room. I'm going to take my hand. I'm going to pick up the toothbrush. I'm going to do this. I'm going to put on my clothes. There are so many steps and pieces into any day tasks that can start to be a warning sign. Someone can start to get steps and plans out of order, out of sequence. And so then there could be increased confusion, right? Because maybe they're starting to forget steps into one task, one familiar task, right?
Okay.
This isn't necessarily a new task, but trouble completing familiar tasks. Another warning sign. And so you could see that somebody might start to have challenges in driving to the bank. I'm picking on the bank. That's not popular anymore. Let's say the grocery store. We've gone there 3 or 4 times a week and starting to say, no, you're at the intersection. You're like, well, where do I turn again? So we start to see that impacts cognitive deficits, but then we start to see perhaps, losing where you are, right? So that's when we say familiar task, nothing necessarily new, but things that we do every day that we take for granted.
Well, what you just said really rings a bell with me because my own mother used to drive 15 minutes to church every day. And one day she told us it took her an hour and a half to get home. There's no way it takes an hour and a half to go that distance. She obviously got lost along the way.
Right.
And to her covering it up, it just took extra time that day.
So, Christine, thank you for sharing your story, but also thank you for saying the covering it up. So that I can't tell you. So my uncle, who I mentioned about the freezer and the keys. So he, they must have slipped from the top of the fridge down to the freezer, or he said, oh, I'm really tired today. I'm having a really bad day. I've been really busy. So all of those sentence starters, excuses, right? Cover-ups. That can be very common. And then the downside of it, though, could be, and I keep saying accusatory behavior, blaming someone else, because my grandmother was really good at that and did it quite a bit. But it would, depending on the family dynamic or that support system, that can go a certain way, right? So I think that's an important thing that you mentioned, Christine, is that in the very earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease, that's very normal. And so that's why it's so important to observe. And I would say the Alzheimer's Association has a fantastic sheet and information on the 10 warning signs and talking about the difference between the two, but also questions to ask. So if you feel like your loved one, could be experiencing some changes or things that aren't quite right, there is actually helpful tips if there's memory challenges to kind of decipher some things perhaps prior to going to the physician, and being as communicative as possible with your physician, sharing, well, I'm starting to notice this on a regular basis, like keeping notes. Like we're noticing that maybe when they are going to the store, they are taking longer than usual.
Okay.
Maybe we've noticed some slippage in paying bills, right? We're noticing over the past couple months, they're not being done on a regular time because we're starting to say completing familiar tasks, right? We're missing or we're forgetting because of short-term memory loss, or we're forgetting how to pay a bill, whether it's via a check or online, right? We're starting to see that. The other thing I will mention is that can really could be a sign is the decrease in activities or social engagement. So when we talk about other things that could be causing dementia, depression is one, right? But we start to see that the desire to participate in things that usually make them happy, whether it's going out to eat every Friday with their friend, or whether it's being a part of a social group or a civic organization, you start to see some changes in whether they're forgot, right, that they have that appointment, or too much stimuli in the earliest stages of the disease. They start to have problems with word finding, right? Now, again, we all sometimes have a problem with that, but again, it's consistency and speaking, sometimes in writing, but also the being able to understand communication and understand everything coming out of someone's mouth. And so we start to see, and that can be something that might not be noticeable when talking with someone who might be in the early stages of the disease, but it takes a lot more time for them to process information and then pausing for a second to say, okay, now I can communicate. So if they start to experience trouble in having conversations, they might not want to participate in things that they used to. And so that's just something that we typically don't think about. But as the disease progresses, unfortunately, we see that someone understands about 3 or 4 out of the words coming out of your mouth. Then as we progress to the middle stages, they understand about half. So then we have, we have caregiver tips on communication, on keeping things simple, keep getting to the point, land that plane, as I have people in my life tell me, right? Avoid verbal diarrhea, right? Too much information, too much can be a challenge, right? Especially if someone is progressing and actually has that diagnosis. So
something that comes to mind as you say that, you were talking about the understanding and the change in social. I've seen it happen going out to eat. What I've seen is, oh, that sounds good, I'll have the same thing. Because they're not, that to me, I guess, finding the words or processing the menu.
There's so much on a menu, depends on where you go. It is. And that's a very good example to amplify what that is, typically too, a caregiver tip, as we kind of intertwine them in here, is you still want to provide that individual with choices, right?
Sure.
We don't want to do everything and decide everything for them, but being able to say, maybe give them 2 choices, typically, 1 or 2, red or blue, steak, spaghetti. Typically, they're going to pick the last thing that you said.
Yes.
So word processing. So if you need to manipulate it and you think the red outfit's going to look better, that's what we used to do with my grandma. I'll pick the red outfit. And so still being able to provide them the opportunity for their self-worth and self-dignity is beyond important with this. But absolutely. And I think too, the last warning sign that I'll mention is the trouble understanding. So think about restaurants, trouble understanding visual images and spatial relationships. So that one we typically don't talk about with the warning signs, but what we start to see, the impacts in the brain. So we talk about the amyloid plaque that build up in the brain cells. It starts to deteriorate and impact parts of the brain. that enables us to understand that if there is a white plate and I'm presented white mashed potatoes and white cauliflower on a white plate, my ability, if I'm experiencing Alzheimer's disease or in the early stages, I might have a challenge understanding that there's anything on my plate. So we start to see challenges with visual relationships, depth perception. So you might start to see someone as they progress, hesitancy in walking down a step. They might have a challenge in understanding how far down their foot or is to that step. The last thing we start, and I'm sure for those of you listening, or probably have, if you had experience with anyone with some type of dementia, driving. That's all I have to say, the word driving.
Yes.
So early on, unfortunately, we see in people with Alzheimer's disease are still driving, right? We know that it is a given right. There are things that you can do to eliminate that. There's many different strategies, but driving can absolutely be impacted. It can be a warning sign because there is an accident. There is an right? There are things we start to see, not just forgetting where to go, but understanding where I am in my car in relation to a sidewalk, or understanding red means stop, yellow, so that can be very dangerous. That's an issue. And so driving and dementia, there's a whole course, there's resources, there's support on that, on how to give up the keys. A really good thing to do if your loved one does have a diagnosis is to get it in writing, right? And
Yes.
that's, how important is that, Christine?
Oh my gosh. Right? I
Very
think that
important.
it was the document from the doctor that I had to show my mother. This is what it says. You can't drive alone anymore. And the rationale or the masking or whatever it is that they put into, that's not all the time. That's only at night. That doesn't mean,
Yeah.
but what you say about the signs, I do know with my own mother, we saw a few dents here and there, and it wasn't necessarily involving another party. It was involving like you mentioned, the sidewalk or something like that.
Yeah.
So interesting, but necessary to pay attention to those aspects of it, right?
It is. And there's some individuals I know that I've talked to families that they've said that their loved one gave up the keys themselves. They were nervous. They felt, right. They had the reasoning still, ability
Right.
to realize like that they just didn't feel right behind the wheel, right? But again, one of the other warning signs as we go into these is decreased judgment. Reasoning. We talk about some of the deficits with their cognitive disorder is the reasoning thinking. The ability to reason is unfortunately starts to deteriorate their judgment. So, but one thing is when you've met one person with Alzheimer's disease, you have met one person with Alzheimer's disease. We're all unique individuals,
Yes.
and how we experience this disease is going to look different because, like I said, personalities as well. But we have had some families that said they've been grateful because they have said to themselves, I don't want to do this anymore. But, going back to the physician, the physician can be the bad guy or girl. I know that we've had that strategy before where they might not listen to their daughter
No.
or their spouse. But if their doctor, who's maybe been their doctor for many, many years, and they trust them, and they say, look, this is what you can or can't do, just like take this medicine, do this. Oh, by the way, and you can't drive, right? It's like, here are the things that you need to do in order to take care of yourself, right? So a lot of times we will, that's a suggestion, that's a strategy with families.
I will also share the strategy that we used. We leaned on eyesight, not memory. And
Yes.
that's a physical thing and no one likes it, but we were able to lean on that. As you talk about judgment, I can also share personally, my mother before she really started to go downhill, I suppose, the one incident, she knew exactly where she was going and she was no longer driving. So she was walking. She was going to go across the street to the shopping center where there was a Verizon store. The problem is that judgment, she lost sight of the fact that that street she was crossing was a 6-lane highway. So
Mm.
fortunately, she was stopped before that happened.
Oh my
But at
goodness.
that point, she was completely independent and
Mhm.
we had taken away the car, but she still, you know, it was that judgment. So as you're talking about these things, so many bells are going off in my head about the personal experiences. And if it's happening like that for me, I can only imagine for our audience members, how
Yeah.
many bells are going off for them as well.
Yes. Yes, and it is one of those things that it's a difficult. So if you're have someone that that you're like, oh my goodness, it can be a hard conversation starter to have as well. And so that's why it's important to if you feel like yourself or your loved one might be you're noticing these changes. The first piece of advice we have at the Alzheimer's Association is to seek advice of the healthcare provider, whoever is currently taking care of that individual, to get a diagnosis, or what I say is to rule out other things. So when we
Right.
talk about the importance, your original question here about why is it important to get a diagnosis, it is to know, rule out what is going on. Why is Sally Sue experiencing this? And so there could be, again, B12 deficiency can be very common in individuals over the age of 65. Depression, dehydration, right? So we first want to say, okay, let's rule out what we call reversible dementias, potentially.
Right.
However, you know, if there is a diagnosis, making sure that there's a plan in place. And so I know how important it is to have all legal affairs, financial affairs in place, because you want to avoid a crisis, and I'll just pick on driving, to happen and before you're getting that diagnosis. So having a care plan in place, so if there is an actual diagnosis of some form of dementia, right? Well, how are we going to pay for this? Right? Looking at all your assets, making sure that if you need to go to a financial advisor or a certified elder law attorney, we recommend to kind of go through, here are my options. Here are some things that, we need to do so that we can make sure we're prepared for the impact of the disease, because we know that it does go into stages and it doesn't just typically a year, right? Someone on average, now again, everyone's different, 8 to 12 years, depending, they can live with, specifically with Alzheimer's type, depends on when they're diagnosed, right? Unfortunately, we still have people who are diagnosed later on. And the last thing I'll mention is the importance of a diagnosis early, is that more and more, as research is increasing and we're progressing on being able to fund more of the NIH, is that we have more treatments in the pipeline that can potentially help slow down progression. In right now, we have an FDA approved drug called lecanemab, that is approved, that can help to, again, it's infusion. It's very, very, very specific to someone in the very early stages, mild dementia or mild cognitive impairment, that could actually slow down the progression. We've never had that in the science community. It's a big deal, but there's more in the pipeline that's looking at many different facets of this disease. And so the headline here is that it's so important that if we get an early diagnosis, and if that individual or you as a family member want to talk about, well, what are my treatment plans? You can do it, in the earlier the better, to take advantage and to understand your options. So financially, legally, understand your treatment options. And also, if that someone is empowered to be a part of advancing the movement on more treatments, to be a part of a clinical trial. And so we're very fortunate, and many parts of Pennsylvania, that we do have institutions that do have clinical trials across the Commonwealth to get involved in.
That's awesome. Now I'm going to shift a little bit because I don't want to run out of time before we address a couple other critical things. I know the causes and the risk factors involved with Alzheimer's and dementia can be varying, but there are some things you can actually influence. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes. And so, to set the stage, there are things that you can control and that you can't control. So I'll start there. Like I'm a control person, so I want to know what are things that I can't control. But we do know that we don't ultimately know what causes dementia, right? There's no single cause, but we do know that age is the greatest risk factor. So over the age of 65, we know that more Americans have Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. We have over 7 million nationwide and over 280,000 in Pennsylvania. But again, normal is not, dementia is not a normal part of aging. But another risk factor is family history, genetics. So it doesn't mean just because you've had a sibling or a parent who has Alzheimer's disease means you're going to get Alzheimer's. It just means that you have increased your risk. Then we also know that gender, race, and ethnicity, there are populations that are at greater risk, which will tie into then things that we potentially can influence. And so we know that Black African Americans are twice as likely than their white counterparts to have Alzheimer's disease. Hispanic Latino Americans are 1.5 times as likely. And then we see that women are at the epicenter of this disease, and they are about 60% of women are the caregivers. But we also know that about 2/3 of the people with Alzheimer's disease are women.
Wow.
And so when you take those populations out, right, we see that, well, why are they at greater risk? This goes into then what we're finding backed up by science. It's important. We know that potential lifestyle interventions, so globally, 40% of the cases of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, Alzheimer's disease being the most common type, could have been prevented by modifiable risk factors. So what that looks at is your overall physical activity and health. So managing those cardiovascular issues. And so what we tend to see, going back to those audiences I mentioned, they're at greater risk for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity. And so what we find is that there are some healthy habits for your brain that can be adopted, whether you're 10 years old or you're 90 years old. It's never too late to start. And we have another campaign the Alzheimer's Association launched early this year. There's 10 healthy habits for your brain. And I will spotlight a couple of them. And so one of them is challenging your mind, right? And so this does not mean, I think some of you have probably heard of the use it or lose it. Challenging your mind is really being able to increase brain cells. Anytime that you learn something new, you're actually increasing the connectivity between your brain cells, which I know you and I don't think about this on a regular basis. Like, oh, I learned how to cross stitch. Oh, well, guess what? I'm doing something good for my brain. We don't think that way, but maybe we should start thinking that way because it's actually really good brain health. And so challenging your mind is going to look different for me than it is for you, Christine, right? So anything that stimulates your brain cells. So it could be something where it could be that I learned to do, and I'm picking on cross stitch because I don't know how to do that, right? But it could be frustrating for somebody else. Another thing you could do that is just as good as doing a Sudoku puzzle is mixing up your activities with your non-dominant hand. So something that I tend to do maybe about on a monthly basis to keep my brain cells active and motivated is if I'm, your non-dominant hand, brush your teeth or try to do something with that. It's challenging my mind. I will tell you, try it today or tonight and let me know how it goes. But you don't want to do something that frustrates you either, because we talk about stress. So challenging your mind is one. The other is, there's some standard ones. I talk about cardiovascular issues, controlling your blood pressure, know your numbers, know what's good for your heart is good for your brain. The ability to manage diabetes, midlife obesity, maintaining a healthy weight. And that's going to look different for everybody. And that's going to be something that you talk to your provider about. Moving. Anytime that you're providing good blood flow, 25% of the blood that's pumped from the heart comes right here to our precious brain. So being able to move, and when I say move, It is not running a marathon. It is not necessarily saying that you have to do this intense sport activity. It could be gardening. It could be anything that is good for you that produces good oxygen flow. That's when we talk about good moving. And sleeping, getting a good night's sleep is going to look different for everybody, but sleeping well, there's actually a lot of fascinating studies and research going on right now looking at sleep. It's really looking at good quality sleep. So not saying that you got to get 8 hours of sleep, right? It's really saying that good quality sleep and knowing that if you have challenges, like if there's sleep apnea, to please seek advice of your provider on managing that, because we know that sleeping well is also good for your brain and being able to function and to be able to do a Sudoku puzzle, right? So it's actually very fascinating. There's a lot of really good things and things for all ages. So protecting your brain, wear a helmet, for goodness sakes. Sports, being mindful of impact onto your brain. And then smoke free. I mean, we unfortunately, we know smoking is bad, right? So it's continuously these science-backed healthy habits. Smoke free has been on every list since we've started this campaign. And so again, I would say for more information, definitely connect with the Alzheimer's Association. We have a lot of really good examples of what you can do, and it's never too late.
And I will share how people can connect with you, but I don't want to finish up today without some tips for caregivers. I've mentioned my mom, you've mentioned some family members, and you just mentioned some statistics. There are a lot of us that if we're not already caregivers, we are going to be caregivers. And I can tell you there are things that I wish I knew before this journey began in my family. So let's get into a few just maybe little but important things that are tips for caregivers.
Yeah. So first of all, for caregivers, know first of all that you're not alone. I will say, if I hear so often, I wish I had known about you, dot, dot, dot. I think that, if someone asks, do you need help? I always suggest to caregivers, have like a little notebook or have some post-it notes of things that, you really could use. Cause I think people say that a lot. Oh no, what do you need? What do you need? You're not being a burden on someone. Be open. I know everyone's different with this disease, but be open, be vulnerable with and you know who your support system is,
Right.
but know that you're not alone. This is a very isolating disease. And if we want to make sure that as we are trying to normalize the conversation regarding dementia, we know that the better that someone is equipped with support from both education and just empathy and empathetic listening, that caregiver's overall health is going to be improved and the likelihood of them not having depression. All of that comes with many studies we've seen when it comes to reaching out for help and taking advantage of some community resources that are out there. And I know that not everyone likes a support group. People get support in different ways. And I know, when we talk about the association and going into what we offer, we do offer, and other community partners do, and depending on where you live, have support groups that are in person, that are virtual, right? Because we know COVID has taught us that we can connect like we are now virtually, and it's okay. The education, I think, is really important. The more that you understand why your loved one might be repeating themselves and they said the same story over and over again, and you just can't. Understand why. I think education is really important, and also being able to take advantage as well. The Alzheimer's Association offers a 24/7 helpline. That is exactly what it says.
So what I was attempting to do, and I would like to share, as you're referring to the resources that are available, I would like to share the contact information for the Alzheimer's Association, because we could go on for another hour here, right? There's so much that we've mentioned, and please do continue to reference those caregiver resources, but I want people to know where to go, www.alz.org/PA. And Sara, just in our last few seconds, can you talk about this helpline?
The helpline is available 24 hours, 7 days a week. It is available in 200 different languages. And if you call the 1-800 number, you're going to have someone who's been trained to be able to listen and to help navigate if you're looking for resources, depending on where you are, and really just, what do I do? And so it's a fantastic, lifeline a lot of times for people who are seeking information, but also just support.
And I appreciate that. I don't want to, I can also share my own contact information. Anyone can reach out to me or to Sara, but if you want to reach me at outspoken.info or email me at christine.outspoken.info. I really think that, as I said, we could go on for quite some time, but just know that there are those resources through the association. I think it's important. You were mentioning the stages and just knowing where your loved one is. I know for me, something I learned late in the game was don't confuse them with the truth. And I know we're going over the allotted time. There's so many things that we could discuss. I would tell anybody to look at the Alzheimer's Association website. Wandering is also a concern, and there are programs out there and there are things that you can do. So please connect with me or Sara.